Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the newest episode of Inflection Point Podcast, where we are dedicated to the art of listening in authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of self-awareness, understanding, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter. Welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So our topic for today's conversation is race, redlining, and medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. And so if you've been following us, you know we've been doing a series entitled The Sanfoka Generational Leadership Continuum. And I define this continuum as a through line running from historical leaders of the past to contemporary leaders of the present, to those who will emerge as future leaders. Melding together historical and contemporary reality, this through line inspires resistance, activism, art, literature, ethnography, and research to fuel transformation. So, race, redlining, and medicine in St. Louis. So we're going to start off by giving you a little bit of background information on the city of St. Louis. And I have an article here. It's called The Story of Segregation in St. Louis by Jeanette Cooperman. And this article appeared in October 17th of 2014. And I'm just going to read, I have a couple of articles. I'm just going to read one quote and then we'll talk about it a little bit. This article is The Story of Segregation in St. Louis. And here's the quote. St. Louis is divided along many lines, and race plays a role in every one of these divisions. It also determines our future because if you make a transparent map of racial segregation and lay it over other maps, political power, cultural influence, health, wealth, education, and employment, the pattern repeats. So here's another article and a quote, and it's entitled Redlined, a St. Louis Story by Jacoby Commons. Deeply rooted systems of redlining have disproportionately affected Black and Brown people dating back to the 1920s. So if you connect that sort of dot back, now we're talking like Jim Crow era. So going back into that history, we're talking like Jim Crow era. And in 1915, there was an initiative petition that basically avoided having mixed blocks occupied by both white and colored people. In other words, we're talking segregation. So here's the specific quote. Written to the Board of Election Commissioners petitioning white and colored citizens to live separately. In section 1 and 2, the petition describes the strict requirements that would be upheld in a new St. Louis ordinance mandating specific blocks be created. Section 3 defined the word block. Later sections of the petition have been omitted, but included penalties that would be carried out if ordinances were broken by either race group. And then finally, another article, it's entitled How Racism Takes Place by George Lipsitz And he writes that in St. Louis, protection of white property and privilege guided nearly all decisions about law and policies that promoted the establishment of new, small, and exclusive suburban mentalities with restrictive zoning codes. And so what's interesting is this petition was one of the early petitions, when you look at the history of what's going on in this time period, one of the early petitions of sort of applying inequality, if you will, and segregation as it relates specifically to housing, right? And so most of us remember Michael Brown and that whole incident, which took place in St. Louis, Missouri, with all of the protesting and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, there's a very deep racialized history in St. Louis, Missouri. And when you think about it from that historical perspective, it's a Midwest state, right? But it also has very strong Southern influence when you think about that Southern history. And it's also linked directly to the Great Migration, thinking about that influx of Black folks leaving the South and going out to Midwest, coming up north and all of that. At one time, there also had slaves sold on the steps of the old courthouse. And as I mentioned earlier about the housing, the first referendum in the nation to impose racial segregation in housing. And then you look at urban renewal. We all kind of know what urban renewal is, and it's kind of eminent domain and, you know, new construction, new highways, but oftentimes those urban renewal activities really impact the Black community. And what showed up in St. Louis is these ghost neighborhoods, once thriving Black communities that have been pretty much destroyed. So Mavis and Gail, when you think about St. Louis, or you think about, you go back and you think about Michael Brown, and, you know, I've been to St. Louis once, just sort of passing through, right? So I've never like stayed there, and we were downtown where the big arch is and all of that. So we were literally just kind of passing through. But when I look at the history of segregation, it's very powerful, and remnants of that are still there today. And when you think back with the death of Michael Brown and how that all played out, it just makes me really, really, as I often do, just kind of sitting back and realizing how deeply steeped we still are in racism in this country. So thoughts, Mavis, Gail?
Well, what's amazing to me is how many people don't realize that, and don't realize the history of a city like St. Louis and many other cities, and how much they were feeding into the segregation until it wasn't serving them any longer, which is what you'll get into later with the hospital. It's just, you have to awaken. We all have to awaken.
I am one of those people, Gail. You know, I drive
Well, we all have been.
I drive through St. Louis when I head, you know, to my family in Kansas, and never noticed, never thought about it. It just feels like I'm almost home. But I've not spent any time there. I don't know anyone there. I think I would have noticed if I had, you know, been in some neighborhoods or businesses or whatever. But I am surprised, sort of, that the history is so rough. But the whole idea of the migration coming up the river, you know, it just makes sense that St. Louis would still be Southern and still have those Southern attitudes.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
It's very current still, really. You know, we'll tell them more of that story here in a bit.
Absolutely. And again, the whole idea of segregation when it comes to housing And if I'm not mistaken, that petition was actually defeated, but what ended up happening was within white communities, there were these agreements. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Gentleman's Agreement. It's a very interesting film, and it really talks about the very subtle ways that people in well-to-do communities, white communities, will come together with these covenants or these gentleman agreement. Actually, one of the primary actors in the film is Gregory Peck. It's a really, really good film. And it really, really shows how just below the surface, we've talked about the niceness and, that sometimes people exhibit niceness, but below the surface is something completely different. And when you have communities where there's this unspoken agreement, and I'm talking besides just a blatant redlining and that sort of thing, but when there's this unspoken agreement that if I decide to sell my house, I will not sell it to a Black family.
Or even biracial.
Or a biracial family, yes.
Right.
Or when you think of the stories where people have had, there's a term for it, a straw buyer. I think I read that somewhere, where someone who presents as a white person, like you, Mavis, go into a particular place, look at a home, purchase that home, but you're really purchasing that home on my behalf. Because if I go into that same community looking the way that I do, it's going to be an issue in terms of me being able to secure that. Right. And so when you lay all of this stuff together, you can really, really see, or hopefully you can really begin to see how deeply, deeply ingrained all of this actually is, which is the reason why we do this work, right? So we can have these open conversations and begin to look at things from a different kind of perspective.
I saw another film. I wish I could recall the name, but it was about that story of a Black family buying into a white neighborhood, and the white people freaked out and just tortured this family.
Right.
Tortured this family until the woman, I remember her going, just sort of insane over the whole thing, just because they were just living there. I'm sure I want to say it was a little bit satirized, but I'm sure it's happened.
Well, that's not that different than when in the mid-1960s my family moved us into a very white neighborhood that was just beginning to develop in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. And a Black family moved in, and somebody burned the cross on the front of their yard. And it was, I was shocked, but I remember saying that I couldn't believe no one was talking about it. No one acted surprised. And that's kind of that agreement, that covenant, among others, that which was horrific. That was in the mid-1960s.
Yeah. Did that family move away then, or what happened after that?
I don't remember. And I don't remember.
And you weren't getting any information about it either. So.
No. And I was 14, 15, so it wasn't easy to get information.
No. So now let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about an example of when there's an oasis that kind of pops up in the Black community, right? And when you think about, for example, Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, sort of being this oasis, right? And when I say oasis, I'm talking about a Black community that is thriving. I'm talking about a Black community that is filled with Black businesses. I'm talking about a community where it's a walkable community, as an example, right? And at one time, St. Louis had such a community, right? And in the space of that community, one of the things that really, really cemented that sort of oasis, if you will, was the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which came into existence in 1937, is when the building was completed and opened. And then in 1979, it was closed. And so between 1910 and 1920, we saw that huge increase in the Black population, specifically in St. Louis, to the tune of about 60%. So they had a public hospital, right? So again, put yourself in the mind of Jim Crow, segregation, Black people education, Black people water fountain, white people this, Black people that. That was how our society was structured, right? And so there was a public hospital in St. Louis that served only whites. So just let that sink in for a minute. A hospital that only serves white folks, okay? So there was no facility for Black patients, Black staff, or anything like this, right? So then by the time 1919, it starts to roll around, Black community leaders are working to persuade the city to purchase a hospital that would serve the Black community. And so again, this is under segregation. We have our hospitals over here. You don't have a hospital, so you're just going to have to try to figure things out on your own because we don't have space for you and your kind, right? And so that happened. So they got this hospital and they called it City Hospital Number 2. But the problem was, with the growth in the population, it really wasn't able to meet the needs of, at that time, it was about 70,000 Black residents living in this area called the Ville, right? And so you have this push towards getting a hospital. It's obviously a segregated hospital, but it doesn't really serve the needs of the community. So then enter the picture this gentleman by the name of Homer G. Phillips. He was born Wesley Phillips. So I'm not going to go too much into his past history, but I really want to talk about the influence that he had in St. Louis. So he was a lawyer, a Howard University trained lawyer. He was also a political figure and an advocate for civil rights. So he enters into the picture with all of this conversation going on. We have this City Hospital Number 2, but it's not really adequate. It doesn't really serve our needs. And we're not able to go and use the other city hospital because we're operating under segregated conditions.
Anita, wasn't Hospital Number 2 the one where they made the only served a few Black people in the basement?
Yeah.
Originally, right. Originally.
That really
Exactly.
left visual with me. So they could wait in line to go there.
Right. And so that was their
Not nearly
idea
enough.
of having a hospital that could serve folks, right?
Right.
So you go down in the basement, I mean, just no dignity whatsoever, right? And so Homer G. Phillips, ended up leading a campaign for civic improvements and this bond issue for the construction of a larger hospital specifically for Black residents. Now, one of the things that I read about this gentleman is that it wasn't that he was a segregation proponent, right? It was just the fact that under segregation, there's a huge need in a community for a hospital that can serve the needs of that community. And so it ended up being a segregated hospital, meaning that it served basically the Black residents in St. Louis, right? But what was interesting about this hospital is that it became one of the top hospitals in the country. So in 1944, it was ranked among the top largest general hospitals in the United States. This is a hospital residing in segregated St. Louis at the time, serving the needs of Black folks. But what's really remarkable is that by 1948, its medical residents included over one third of all graduates. So not only was it a hospital or a space that served the needs from a medical perspective, it was very prestigious.
And a training hospital.
Right, it was a teaching training hospital, exactly.
Teaching,
Yeah.
training hospital. So you think about it. If you're in the white majority who is pushing back against this hospital being even existing, and then you see that this hospital is rising up as a very prestigious place, rising up of the Black community as a very prestigious place. And one of the people that I noted was a Dr. Helen Elizabeth Nash, a pediatrician known for breaking racial and gender barriers in the medical field. And this is the exciting part, decreasing infant mortality. Because I believe the number that I saw was something like 97% of the babies that were born in this section of St. Louis and went to that hospital, she was instrumental in defeating or bringing down infant mortality. So by 1961, Homer G. Phillips Hospital had trained, this is so exciting, the largest number of Black doctors in the world. So what started off as something designed to meet the needs of the community blossomed into something that went way beyond just meeting the needs in that immediate community. The prestige, the recognition blossomed, right? And so when you think about something like that, and you think about it within the context of this storyline that we get fed continuously about Black folks being less than. They don't have the capacity for this. They don't have the intellect for that. But when we're given, when we, not even given, but when the opportunity is there for us to simply grow, for us to simply live, we do some amazing things. And the Homer G. Phillips Hospital is one example of the amazing things that come out of the Black community and Black America. Comments?
Yeah, the other things that I saw in the film that we watched, The Color of Medicine, was not only did they do that clinically, but they did it from a business standpoint too. They got the people in there that knew what to do and how to run a hospital, because the administration and the business aspect of a hospital is crucial, right? And they succeeded at all those levels.
And they strove for excellence.
Yes,
in
it was
all things,
high excellence.
detail.
Yes.
Yeah, high excellence. I remember hearing the part about the nurses the uniforms were designed just so, and everyone was to wear them in a certain way and have certain shoes that were designed to be comfortable for long hours, and their silk shoestrings had to be tied in a certain way. That is standard for the way that like hotels now try and project this excellence, let's hold the towel this way, all those little things. They demonstrated that. And what I suspect is that they just discovered it on their own. No other people came in and said, strive for it this way. Right. The sense I get is that this was all homegrown. Right. And I guess the other part is that it just became the center for a community. It was walkable for people to get there, and everybody kind of knew each other. You passed your coworkers on the street, and that sense of community seems to be very threatening somehow to white
Right.
people.
Well,
And it sounded lovely.
The families and sometimes the parents and then the children, when they grew up, they became also interested in the medical field. And so it became a generational pattern that was happening. And of people that lived in this community, they all were striving for education and training and excelling, and they did.
Mm-hmm. And Black doctors wanted to be at this hospital. You know, remember the little vignette about some doctors on their way to Kansas City.
Yes,
and
yes.
stop in St. Louis, and they're thinking,
Right.
An all-Black hospital? Yes, please. Yeah.
And another interesting thing they said is that they felt safe there. And we
Yes.
don't allow ourselves to realize how unsafe
Yes.
colored Black people feel in a situation where they might be in that minority. And how horrible that is.
Or
And for
being
them to find-
or being in a space where racism just
Right.
is not embedded in that space.
Mm.
So there's a huge
Yes.
difference between going back into this time period, going in. Just imagine how you would feel as a Black person going into City Hospital number 2, where you're being taken down into the bowels of the hospital because that's where you belong, versus going to a place like the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, where
Right.
you are welcomed there. Number one, you are treated like a person, treated like a human being, and respectful. So the absence of racism is what made that space so powerful, even though it was a segregated. So that sort of cloud, if you will, of racism hung over it, but that was not the space. That cloud did not permeate in the space, and the way that they worked with one another, the way they took care of their patients, it just wasn't there.
It was a safe space for patients and for the practitioners there.
For the staff, absolutely, absolutely. So it's time for us to take a short break. And we'll take this short break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation. And we'll get a little bit deeper into what either Mavis or Gail mentioned, The Color of Medicine, which is a documentary film that really digs deep into the story of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back and resume the conversation. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast as we continue our discussion of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, a monumental tribute to the genius of Black medical professionals in St. Louis, Missouri. So before we went on break, we started talking about this documentary film, and the title of the film is The Color of Medicine, the Story of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And it's a documentary film that debuted in 2018. And it describes the all-Black hospital in terms of its achievements of healthcare workers among the first Black physicians and nurses medically trained in the United States. And I think the thing that's really cool about the documentary is that it's told from the perspectives of people who were actually there. Yeah. People who trained there, people who took care of patients there, people who learned there, various medical professionals and experts, and some historians, just telling the story, this beautiful, beautiful story of what this space was like and what that space meant for the Black community. And so it kind of connects into this battle to receive quality medical care, medical treatment, and the training. Because it's one thing for you to go into a space where the quality, the care is there. But when you're in that space and nobody in that space looks like you, that can sometimes be a little bit problematic. And it can sometimes be one of those things that adds to mistrust and things of that nature. And so when you think about the role of that hospital, it was the first institution in the country to treat Black patients in a safe, hygienic, and sterile environment. Just let that sink in. And when you think about it, go ahead, Mavis. No, go ahead. Go
Just
ahead.
real quick, there was one phrase that jumped out to me in the film that said that they didn't have to suffer the physical indignities of being, you know, when you go into a hospital and hand your body over, it's difficult anyway, let alone that racial history. Many of these people who had parents who were, you know, probably alive during Reconstruction, and you know, they had the history in their families. The word indignities really got me, because everybody deserves dignity, especially when they're the most vulnerable. So I just want to slip that in there. Yeah, that really got me.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were so many good points that were being made in the film. And I like the fact that they did it from the perspective of people who actually were there, nurses that were there, nurses and doctors who started off their careers there and then moved on gradually, and particularly after the hospital was closed. But it's also interesting when you think about how the hospital was closed, right? And this idea that the hospital was a segregated hospital, but it was not segregated by choice.
Right.
It was segregated based on the era, based on what was going on in the larger context of St. Louis as a city. We adopted a segregationist mindset. I should say they adopted a segregationist mindset and then began to embed that all the way into all levels of society, including healthcare, right? But I would say the surprise came at how successful the hospital was, right?
Nita, were you talking about white people just before, in terms of,
Yes, yes. As the segregation laws were coming on the books, as the zoning laws and all of this stuff were coming on the book, it's almost like telling a person, I want you're only allowed to be in this space over here, but you're also not allowed to make that space over there better or equivalent to my space over here.
Or even yours. You can't call it yours.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
And so we didn't address the state just yet that the hospital was closed by force in 1979, right? I don't know if we already said that, but I just wanted to put that in context.
It was right. It was not agreed upon. It was forced.
Yeah.
No, so that's exactly what I'm leading up to.
Okay.
Because when you understand the forces that were in play that called for the closing of the hospital, right? And now you're starting to get into funding issues. Oh, because you're a segregated hospital and segregation is now against the law. So it becomes an easy way for this hospital, this sacred space, if you will, to be shut down using the excuse or the idea that we're now moving into segregation. So therefore, the people in the Black community, you now can come into these integrated spaces. But we all know that integration does not equal equity.
No,
it does not equal equity.
Well, and the government was
overnight.
St. Louis was trying to close this hospital down long before it actually did, and to the point when the laws came back and said that you're not allowed to segregate, we have to integrate. There were doctors and nurses that would leave and go elsewhere. But then they also brought in people that were from, that were Asian American or that were from other
Exactly.
countries to accommodate,
Exactly.
right?
And it's just fully recognizing the fact that the only reason it existed as a segregated hospital is because that was the social structure that you created. You created that.
But because it was a community hospital, the community, the government in St. Louis had the ability to shut it down.
Exactly. Exactly. And the fact that it was so successful.
Right. That's right.
Because those success stories in the Black community that come out of the Black community don't align with the narrative that defines who we are under this sort of white supremacy definition. It just doesn't fit.
No.
And so I'd rather destroy something that you have rather than allowing you to continue to grow and benefit from that thing. That's not very different from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right? You're looking for an excuse to get rid of something. And so with the hospital, it was, oh, we're switching to integration now. But that switch to integration it took away that safe, hygienic, and sterile environment for me to come into as a Black person. It took that away.
Yeah.
Right? The same way in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you burn down. All it took was some little lie.
Yeah.
A little lie. But that little lie gave you what you needed, gave you the excuse to burn down an entire community.
Or what you wanted. What
you wanted, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because when communities, Black communities are successful, it's breaking the line of reasoning in terms of how we are depicted socially, in terms of how we get socialized in the United States. We're socialized into believing X about Black folks, all the things, what all those things are that we're socialized into believing about Black people. And then when you have these success stories, it doesn't fit with that model. It doesn't fit with that Jim Crow-like model. And so one of the ways that you can sort of move away from that is by destroying what's there.
Covering up the evidence of what was so successful and incredible.
Yeah.
They had to destroy it.
I think it was this activist, Whale Amusa, in the film, who he really touched me because he was still, how many years later, very emotional about what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yes.
How they came to close the hospital at 5 a.m. in the morning and surprised everybody. No notice, no nothing.
Right.
And there were police dogs and policemen on horseback and all kinds of images. Yeah. But he said the people who closed it were not of St. Louis. They were not a part of it. They didn't support the love, the structure itself. They didn't care about the hospital or the people.
Exactly.
It's easier to kill something, They weren't of the community. They weren't, of the leadership for the hospital.
Exactly. Yeah, they were not a part of that thriving community. Because one of the other things that I found so interesting was the way the community was described by these individuals, right? In the documentary, described it as a thriving community. The businesses were owned by Black people. There was economic stability and wealth stayed in the community. This is the part that really got to me. Kids were raised in a walkable community where folks looked like them. If you recall, when they were talking about when I was in high school, there were doctors and there were nurses and there were lawyers and there were other professionals. I was surrounded by individuals like that. And so these types of individuals became champions of the community.
And role
And
models.
and role models, exactly, exactly. So if you're growing up and you're observing people who are being educated, I'm working on my law degree, or I'm working on my PhD. You have these positive role models. Just imagine how impactful that could be for the kids, the kids that are growing up in that community. And it gave them a sense that there is something beyond high school education, because they could see it.
Right.
It was there. Yeah, they could aspire
Right
to it.
And they could attend right there. I mean, there were schools right there that were built.
Exactly.
Nursing schools and residency programs.
Exactly, because remember the one part where they were talking about that they had this impromptu law classes in the hotel.
Right.
Yes.
Impromptu.
They started their own.
classes
Yeah, right.
in the hotel.
Exactly. Law school.
Exactly.
Well, they actually turned it into a law school, didn't they? They actually
did. Yes.
Law school. And then the guys that were, or the people who were first trained there, became again the law professors for the next round.
Right. Exactly.
Just so empowering to watch.
Yes.
And it's shocking to that, how it ended.
And in terms of like a personal reflection on this film, one of the things that really resonated with me as a connector, if you will, is the Ubuntu principle. I am because you are. And Ubuntu is basically the globalcitizen.org defines it like this. Ubuntu is essentially about togetherness and how all of our actions have an impact on others and on society. And so we're not these separate, enclaves and all of that.
Islands.
In these segregated times, or even when it's not like deeply segregated the way it was in that time period, but you can look and you can see equity is just not there. It just isn't there.
I saw a young friend of mine post, a Black woman post on Facebook, "Bring back segregation." This was, probably before we started this podcast. And I thought, oh, would she even say that? Well, now I understand. Everybody wants a community where they feel they belong and, like you say, feel safe and where they can grow. But, we were talking about this hospital being for Blacks, run by Blacks. And I had asked, if a white person needed a particular skill set, or a surgeon that was there, would they accept a white person? And what was it you told me, Anita?
I said, of course. And, when we talked about that earlier, one of the things that, like, after the conversation, sort of like another connector into that conversation, is there's a documentary called Swastika. What is it?
I watched that.
Yeah.
I forgot that. Swastika and Jim Crow. And it's really about during the Second World War, when people were being expelled from Europe and Germany and all of that, and they were coming to the United States. One of the issues was when some of these people, particularly the Jewish people, came to the United States, they got hit with anti-Semitism, right? And they couldn't get jobs. So you got these professors and these different folks like that, educators and things like that. Guess where they ended up getting jobs? HBCUs.
Black colleges, right?
Black colleges and universities. And so when I think about that Ubuntu principle, that's like an example of these two groups within that context, were deemed as outcasts in the United States, but they came together in community to help one another, because all these professors, they wanted to be able to teach, and all the HBCUs, they needed teachers. right?
right.
And so when you think about that coming together, that was such a good thing. And so getting back to what you just talked about when we were talking about that earlier, if the underlying thought is that if the tables were turned, would Black people behave the same way towards white people? I would say personally, there's no way that would happen. And I'm not saying there might be like pockets of that, but in general, that would not be the case, because if I'm going to curse this thing, like if I'm going to curse racism, and then when the tables are turned, I'm going to now behave exactly the way you behave towards me. That would make me an out and out hypocrite.
Yeah.
That's right.
So it's not really about the tables being turned. If the tables were turned, you would do to me. No, I would not, because I know what it feels like to be discriminated against. Why would I want to turn around and now subject you to that same thing? You all know what I always say. What is it that I ultimately want? To be left alone.
Oh, right.
So I can live my life on my terms, and not by someone else telling me what I can and cannot do simply because of the color of my skin.
Which is not any different than anybody else wants.
Exactly. You think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was a leave us alone community, because we can survive, we can thrive on our own.
And we're not hurting anybody.
And we're not hurting anyone.
We're not hurting anybody. What's the issue?
That's right.
Exactly.
Well, I had to kind of, I don't know, I accidentally tumbled into the thought of, would I have gone to a Black hospital? And a little bit of my socialization popped up, which is I wouldn't have. It would have been communicated to me that it wasn't safe for me. Yeah. And now when I say that, it's like, why would anyone believe that?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's not uncommon to be afraid of things you don't know or understand, but there it was in me, like, that whole neighborhood, that's the way I was raised.
Well, that's the imprinting from generations.
Yeah.
That imprinting comes down from generations, right? And so we have to each have the ability to reframe that and change that into what really is true.
Yeah.
Because it's not true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this country was formed on white supremacy. I mean, Black people were taken from their communities where it was probably segregated, right? There were probably very few, if any, white people, and they were thriving and doing well. And the Native Americans were treated in the same way when the white people came here. So this mentality is filtered down and imprinted generation after generation. And as much as we have changed it, there's still so much more we have to change.
Yeah, so much more. So much more. That fellow that I've referenced a couple of times, Dr. Amusa, said, it's important for the record to show that this community did not give up this hospital. It was stolen.
It was stolen.
It was stolen. Yes.
Right.
Stolen, that word.
Yeah.
All those employees, all those, from janitors to the most talented surgeon, everyone out on the street. And I watched a little bit of it again, and one woman said that the first thing they did was shut down the switchboard so no one could
right. Communication's off.
And isn't that the start of everything, when people cannot communicate with each other?
Right.
They didn't think these the employees of the hospital deserved even a conversation about it first.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of coming up on the end of our time. My final thought on all of this is something that I said earlier, that integration is not synonymous with equity. So just because you integrate something, and you all remember when I told you my story in 1971, where we were under a forced integration system. And for the first time in my life, I I came into the realization that somebody can actually hate me personally because of my Blackness, right? Like up until that point, I knew about racism. My mom was an activist and all of that. But when I went to 9th grade under the new Steel Valley School District, that was the first time for me that I felt personally that somebody was racist towards me as an individual. And so integration is definitely not synonymous with equity.
It needed to have been equity.
Right, exactly. And racism continues to disrupt health and wellness. And healthcare is definitely one of those institutions where integration does not guarantee equity.
That's right.
So we are literally down to like one last minute. So I just want to throw out this final quote. And this is from the Harvard Health blog, Racism and Discrimination in Healthcare Providers and Patients. To fight racism and discrimination, we all need to recognize, name, and understand these attitudes and actions. We need to be open to identifying and controlling our own implicit biases. We need to be able to manage overt bigotry safely, learn from it, and educate others. These themes need to be a part of medical education as well as institutional policy. We need to practice and model tolerance, respect, open-mindedness, and peace for each other. Yes. And so I take that, and I always close the show by relating it back to the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And as always, the final question is, what will you do to ensure that children have the right to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which they were born? So I thank you for joining us, and we'll see you the next time at Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.